So, I'd like to welcome everyone to MTRI's October Lunch and Learn. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting here today in Kespewick, one of the 7 districts of Mi'kma'ki, homeland of the Mi'kmaq people. We want to acknowledge the treaties of peace and friendship, and we want to thank the Mi'kmaq people for their generosity in sharing their homeland with us. So, if anyone's new to MTRI, we are a research-based nonprofit nestled in southwest Nova Scotia near Kejimkujik National Park and Historic Site, and our mission is to promote, conserve, and sustain biodiversity in Kespewick and beyond. So today, I would like to introduce Brittni Scott from the Clean Annapolis River Project. Brittni earned her Master of Science at Acadia University, studying the population dynamics of black bears, and now she is the Private Land Stewardship Coordinator at CARP. I'd like to remind anyone that if they have questions during the talk, they can add them to the chat window, and Brittni can address them either during or at the end, however she sees fit. So, without further ado, Brittni.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction, Chad, and thank you all for coming to my talk today. I am excited to be introducing you guys to the Annapolis Sand Barrens and the work that CARP has been doing there. So our goal with the Sand Barrens project is to gain a better understanding of this understudied ecosystem that's here in Nova Scotia, and ultimately to promote its persistence for future generations. And so sand barrens are a globally rare ecosystem, so it's quite special that we have them here in the valley. So I first want to introduce you guys to some of the history of the sand barrens, so how they came to be here in the valley. So this is a really cool animation put together by the Zurich University of Applied Sciences. And so we're starting at 19,000 BC, which you can see when my arrow is not there. And so Nova Scotia is right about here. And we can see that this ice sheet stretches down towards the northeast coast of the United States. So right around New York, New Jersey area. And we can see at about 19,000 BC that you might not be able to see it too well, but there's a little bit of a land bridge here. You can see some land that does not exist today. But this land bridge connects the northeast coast of the United States to the southern tip of Nova Scotia at this point in time. And as time went on and glaciers receded and sea levels rose, we slowly lost this land bridge. As you can see it disappear there a little bit. And it's right around 10,000 BC where the glaciers left Nova Scotia, were gone completely. And as these glaciers were receding, in certain areas, they were leaving sand in its tracks. So right around the New Jersey area, there's these big regions of sand, and also in the Annapolis area here. And because of that historic land bridge that used to exist here, the sand barrens that exist on the northeast coast of the United States and our sand barrens here in the Annapolis Valley, they have very similar species compositions. So they're very related ecosystems. And these sand deposits that were left here are quite extensive in some parts of the Annapolis Valley. So this is a picture taken in a quarry pit in behind the West Kings District High School. This is in Greenwood. And we have Katie for scale here, Katie from CARP. And imagine, if you will, that the sand was still full here up to this tree line. So this is tons and tons of sand is what we're talking about in some regions of this valley. And on top of all this sand, you can have a few different landscapes, all of them with slightly different species compositions. So in the lower lying areas, we tend to have these sand-based bogs. And in the upland areas, we have these heath-type mosaic landscapes with lots of shrubs, lichens, and then patches of sand. And then we also have these areas that are heavily influenced by human disturbance. So these kind of open sandy areas, and also regions where forests have overtaken these upland heaths. And so much of what I'm talking about today has to do with these upland heath areas. And so for species to thrive and live here, they had to adapt to some pretty extreme conditions. So obviously dry soil, so there's a lot of water drainage with all this sand, and low nutrients, which is very related to that, a lot of nutrient washout. Sun exposure, so it's thought that historically there weren't many forests, or at least large quantities of forests in this area. Regular disturbance, so historically there would have been caribou herds that would graze on this landscape, and these herds would prevent any significant growth of woody species that would overtake the heathlands. So a lot of the species that live in this environment kind of require a little bit of a disturbance regime. And also frequent fires. So I have a little question mark next to this because this is something that CARP is investigating, this relationship with fires on this Sand Barrens landscape. But it's thought that fires were also part of this disturbance regime that is necessary to prevent forests from overtaking these heathland species. So these are all fairly challenging conditions for the average species to live in. So now I want to introduce you to some of the iconic species that live in this ecosystem. So this is the rock rose, also known as the Canada frostweed. It's kind of the poster child of the Sand Barrens. So it's considered endangered in Nova Scotia and has a fairly limited range, as you can see here. So it's not something you would stumble upon unless you knew or where to look, essentially. But it's a really good example of a species that does really well with some form of a disturbance regime. So whether it be caribou or fire, because without such disturbance regimes, it's hard for it not to be outcompeted by other species. We also have the Broom Crowberry. So this is a very abundant species in the Sand Barrens. So you would be likely to see it if you were in one of these areas. And it does have a tendency to occur in environments that are historically prone to fires. And the broom crowberry has a really cool relationship with ants. So it's very mutualistic. Broom crowberries produce little fruits and berries, and the ants will eat these. And in turn, they will take these seeds and deposit them really far away from the broom crowberries. So you get these crescent-shaped seed deposits. So they have ant-dependent dispersal, which is a really cool thing to see in the Annapolis Valley. So around fall, when we have berries on the broom crowberries, you can see these crescent-shaped seed deposits around the Sand Barrens. Another really cool species in the Sand Barrens is the jack pine. So the jack pine is a really cool example of a fire-adapted species. So jack pine have two types of cones. They have your garden variety pine cone, which looks just like you would expect, but they also have these serotinous cones. And so these serotinous cones only open in extreme heats. So for instance, if a fire were to come through on this landscape and destroy the tree itself, this ensures that the tree can reproduce into the next generation, even if it doesn't exist anymore itself. So it's kind of a fun thing that you can do with kids, like these pine cones and fire, and show them that these expand. A couple other important species to mention. So for one, we have the Pine Barrens golden heather. This is a member of the rock rose family. It is an S2 classified species in Nova Scotia, meaning it's considered to be imperiled. And it's generally accepted that this species does really well with some type of disturbance regime also, just like the rock rose itself. So some form of fire or caribou disturbance. A lot of these species in this family also have mutualistic relationships with fungi on their roots, which helps retain water and nutrients, even in these extreme sandy conditions. So that's a really cool adaptation for them to have developed. There's also bearberry. So I have this guy up here. They have very waxy leaves, which help retain water, even in these extreme low water conditions. And they're fairly frequent across the Sand Barrens and often associated with broom crowberry. And also lichen. So there's a decent amount of lichen coverage on the Sand Barrens, a lot of reindeer lichen, but also Icelandic lichens. So there are a number of threats to this ecosystem. For one major one that's considered is loss of disturbance regime. So caribou have been extirpated on the mainland of Nova Scotia since 1905. And as I mentioned before, they were really important for preventing woody forests from overtaking heathland species. Also fire suppression. So now we have people living in this area. So obviously we don't want large fires to take over. So that is kind of related to what I said above with fire being important to prevent woody growth from overtaking the heathland species. Also development. So a lot of highways, a lot of agriculture in the valley, a lot of neighborhoods, which are built right on top of all these sand deposits. Excessive ATV use. So obviously, as you can see in this picture, if there is excessive ATV use, nothing can grow there. But it is important to mention that it's thought that some strategic ATV use might be used to supplement some of this disturbance that we're missing in this environment right now. So that's something to consider for management. And also invasive. So the Scots pine is considered a major invasive in this ecosystem. And it's taking over from native species like the jack pine. And it tends to cause too much shade for the sun-loving heath type species. So just to discuss some of the work that CARP has been up to in the last year, one really important outcome that CARP has come up with was this map. And so before all this work, it's not really known how big the sand barrens used to be or how big they even are today. And so they worked in coordination with Ian Manning and COGS, and they came up with this map. And so we have Kentville here and Greenwood here, just for your reference points. And what they did was that they mapped these sandy soils and the peat type soils in this general area. And they also overlaid a lot of the common species you would see in the sand barrens. And so we have a map here of all the probable areas where you could find sand barrens. So there's still work needed to be done to ground truth some of these. So this is a really cool tool you can access through the CARP website, and you can zoom in and zoom out of all these different regions and see for yourself if some of these areas do seem to be sand barrens or not, so, or your property itself. But likely a lot of these areas are now covered by agriculture or development of some sort. So important to be ground truthing also. Land use change. So this was another really important analysis done in coordination with Ian Manning and COGS. And so what they did was they took aerial photos from 1955, which were taken by the Canadian Forces Air Base in Greenwood, and they stitched them over top of these present day photos that we have. And the purpose of this analysis was to quantify land use change over this time period. And so there's also a link in our website to check this out. So you can zoom in and out of different regions of the valley and see some before and afters, which is just kind of a fun thing to do anyway. But I have just this little excerpt just to kind of give you an idea of the type of things that they were looking for in this analysis. So we're looking at the Canadian Forces Base in Greenwood. And today we can see that there are some sandy patches around it. So we have some sand here and here. This looks to be sand and some sand along this area here. But if we pull this back and look in 1955, we can see that there's areas that seem to be a little bit more indicative of sand. So there seemed to be a little bit more sand in this area previously. Also, there's no golf club here. And there was some development here. I'll just play this again. So we can see that this area wasn't developed back in 1955. So these are the type of things that they were looking for to quantify land use change in the valley. And through this work and the work in general with Ian and COGS, it's been estimated that there's only about 3% of the Annapolis sand barrens left today. So there's been some significant loss in this ecosystem over time. Another really cool project that CARP has been working on has to do with soil horizon analysis. So we've been working with forensic ecologists, which is a really cool term. Didn't know it existed before. But essentially what they're doing is they're looking at these ash layers, and they're looking at the charcoal, and they can carbon date it. And so we can get a better understanding of what the relationship with fire was on this landscape historically. And so we can see how frequent the fires would have been, and we can see when these fires would have been. And this is largely done by Alina here. And another really cool thing we can do with this analysis is look at the charcoal, and we can find signatures of what species used to exist on this landscape and when. So we can look at different tree species. So there's a signature here for pine, and then there's a signature here for oak. But we can also look at seed species and pollen. So we can identify species based off seeds and pollen that we find in this charcoal also. And then we can relate that to what these species compositions look like today. And another really cool thing that we can pick up from this analysis, if we see all these little colorations that are going on here, this is a pretty cool signature that signifies that sweat bee used to live on this ecosystem, and it might still, but we can see that historically there would have been sweat bee here, which is a solitary living bee. And there's also different signatures that would represent evidence of ants on this landscape. Unfortunately, a lot of this work was stalled due to COVID, so the lab was closed down for a while. So we don't have any results, or we don't have all our results back yet for this analysis. But this will be something that will be shared with the public when we do. And another really important part of this project in the Annapolis Sand Barrens is community engagement. So this was about 2 weeks ago. I was able to take some grade 7s out in Greenwood, and we were able to interact with this environment and teach them some species by playing bingo. So COVID hasn't ruined all the fun yet. And another large strategy we have to help preserve this area and come up with a management plan for this area is to work very closely with various stakeholders and landowners in the area and work together to come up with a strategy. And so there's a lot of people that have been involved in this work from the start. So Katie McLean from CARP has been a really big contributor. Sherman Boats from Acadia, Ian Manning from COGS. Nick Hill has been a really big contribution also. This is him showing a kid about the serotinous cones, which is a very fun thing if you're ever in the Sand Barrens to do. And yeah, there's been a lot of collaboration on all this work, and I'm excited to see where it goes. And that's it.
Well, thank you very much, Brittni. That's an awesome talk. Very interesting. So I guess we'll open it up to questions if anyone has any.
I'm not seeing the message board.
No, I don't think anyone has posted a question.
Okay.
So I have a question. With only 3% left intact, that's a very alarming rate. Is there any push from any organizations or from the government to formally protect some of these areas? Do you know?
Well, we have been in talks with people from Lands and Forestry. So there has been talks about it, and it's something that we're trying to work towards, preserving areas based off of ecosystems rather than species alone. So there is interest, but there's nothing in cement development yet.
Okay. Oh, we have a question from Wendy. Yes, Wendy, it will be posted to MTRI's YouTube channel in like a week or so.
I found the group chats.
Wendy also asked if there will be a community walkabout.
So we had a few during the iNaturalist competition that MTRI hosted, but we would be interested in taking more people out. It's really fun to be able to show people the more intact versions of the Sand Barren. So right near the Greenwood exit, there's some really nice pieces of intact Sand Barrens. And if you send me a message, I'm not sure if my contact is anywhere, I can maybe put it on this chat, but you can send me a message, and if I'm ever out there, or we can just coordinate together and I can take you out for a tour of the Sand Barrens.
And similar, like if there's ever groups or partner organizations who want to plan a field trip, then they just need to reach out, and we try and be pretty flexible and responsive. And we also want to figure out like where there's opportunities for kind of longer term citizen science and volunteer opportunities to help in getting a better understanding of some of the less visited areas of the Barrens. Because you'll see from the map link that Brittni shared, there's the sites we go to over and over, but there are lots of other sites that could use some visits. So wherever you see those colorful dots are probably the places we've spent a lot of time.
Be interesting to look at more of these peatland areas too, because it doesn't look like we have too many observations in those areas.
So then this is a multi-year project going on with CARP?
We certainly hope
first years. But yeah, it's looking like we should be able to get the second year of funding is the goal.
Great, good. Do you guys know, I'm just curious, and do you guys know if a lot of the land that has these Sand Barrens, is it privately owned? Is there crown land? Mixed?
It's a lot of privately owned land.
Okay.
And so that's why we have to work so closely with private landowners to help come up with management strategies. Sorry, Kate, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I guess more broadly, the way we conceptualize the project, like as a long-term project, kind of breaks up activities based on the different land ownership and tenure. So we know that we definitely need to work with private landowners because, like Brittni mentioned, the majority of it would be in private ownership. And then within that, we even need to look at land use type. So there's some pretty significant areas used for quarrying. There's agricultural areas. There's development. We have Village of Kingston and Greenwood, which for our watershed would be like some of the larger built environments. We then also have CFB Greenwood. So they would be kind of lands under federal jurisdiction. There's a park that Brittni and I visited for the first time the other week. Like I pass it all the time and never have bothered to go in. It's kind of neat. I forget what it is called, but it's by Michael's Kayaks, like on Highway 1 in Kingston, and lots of big red pines in there. So it'll be mixed. It's mixed ownership. So it's going to mean a mixed approach to working with different landowners and managers to try and see how all these pieces of a conservation plan come together. And I see there's a question about have the land's been protected by one of the land trust organizations, and just kind of a suggestion about nature trust interest. I do believe in some of the initial stakeholder meetings that were hosted by both Sherman and Nick, the Land or Nature Conservancy Canada and the Nova Scotia Nature Trust were engaged. I think one of the challenges from the perspective of our established land trusts is there's so much potential land vying for their attention and very limited resources. So right now, the Sand Barrens would fall outside of their conservation priorities. And so there had been a suggestion from Craig Smith, who is formerly with one of the land trusts, about the potential to establish a new trust focused on this ecosystem, which is a really exciting idea, but I can also attest to the challenge of it because we've recently established a land trust focused on working forests, and there's a lot of just a lot of barriers that need to overcome if you're going to start a new trust, like who's going to run that and secure all the funding. So that is one option that's on the radar, but there's some definite feasibility issues that would need to be considered. And I think we often, like, it's easy to say the nature trust will be interested, but there's also, it's so complicated. They need to be so picky that I think we also need to look at what other protection options might be available too.
There's another question there about will there be more BioBlitz events even next year? And I'm sure there will be plenty of opportunities for that. And we also, fully encourage people to iNaturalist in these areas so we know what's there. But I'm sure there will be some CARP-led BioBlitz events in the future. There's a question there, Katie, about a newsletter. Does CARP do a newsletter?
Yes, we have an irregularly timed newsletter. Sorry, I lost my screen somehow. And I can see that they emailed. If the email came in and there was no response, that is definitely just my fault and it slipped through the cracks. But there is a newsletter. If you go to our website on the homepage, you can register for it. And then between the upcoming events page on our website and our Facebook page, that's where you're going to get the most timely information about future events.
And also the Facebook page is pretty regularly updated.
But one thing we might want to think about too, Brittni, is like, should we build like a sub mailing list focused on the Sand Barrens if there is a variety of prospective volunteers interested, and so we can kind of target those people and not broadcast. I don't want to like send people too much information, but this might be a unique project where there's a contingent of Sand Barrens people we could keep informed on a more regular basis.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a pretty cool ecosystem.
Well, if that's it for questions, I'd like to thank you, Brittni, again, and Katie. That was a really interesting talk, talking about a really important ecosystem that unfortunately not many people have heard of in Nova Scotia, including me, which is shameful. So, in saying that, I'd also like to thank the Region of Queens for supporting our seminars, Venture for Canada for supporting my work here at the Mercy Tobiatic Research Institute, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you again on October 29th at 7 p.m. when Dr. Mike Gill, Director of Biodiversity Indicators Program at NatureServe, will be discussing how biodiversity observations made in Nova Scotia link up to a global system that is assessing the pulse of planet Earth. If you would like to join that talk, you can use the exact same link that was provided to you today. And yeah, we hope everyone is well, and we get to see you all very soon again.
Awesome. Thank you for having us, and thanks everyone for attending this talk.